Hey guys, how you doing? Hope you're doing well. My name is Raelan and I'm going to be talking today a bit about my experience living with and recovering from chronic fatigue syndrome. I had chronic fatigue syndrome for about 10 years before I finally recovered, and what I'm going to be talking about today is something that was absolutely vital for my recovery process. So what I'm going to be talking about today is how to stay mentally strong while recovering from CFS, and why I'm so passionate about this topic specifically over everything else related to chronic fatigue syndrome recovery is because, as I'm sure any of you who are currently living with chronic fatigue syndrome know, that one of the biggest challenges, if not the biggest challenge when it comes to recovering from CFS, is finding those ways to stay motivated, to stay positive, to stay hopeful about your future, to keep getting up out of bed every single day and doing those things that you need to do to try and get yourself better, to try and get your life back. It's important for you to know before I get started that I am not a therapist, I am not a mental health professional of any kind. None of this is meant to replace professional mental health support. It's important to always get professional help in the same way that we would always get professional help when we were having physical issues with our body. So I offer this up today as things that helped me, as things that worked for me, as suggestions for you to consider, options for you that may or may not work, things that you could talk to about with your own counselor, with your own professional therapist, and see if they make sense for you. So I'm going to be breaking this into two parts, and today we're going to discuss part one, which are 8 things to avoid when recovering from CFS to help you stay mentally strong. And next week, I will get into part 2, which will be 8 things to start doing. Now, the first thing to avoid when recovering from chronic fatigue syndrome is reading too much about chronic fatigue syndrome. As much as I love to educate myself as much as I can about this illness, my experience over the years is that reading too much about CFS can be emotionally counterproductive, because so much of what is out there that I found focuses on how virtually no one recovers from this, and that the medical community at large is baffled by it, and there just really seems to be no hope. And taking in a lot of this when you are trying to recover, when you are trying to find that motivation to keep getting up every day and working to get yourself better, can really not be helpful. I've also found over the years of my reading that a lot of what I read started to feel quite repetitive. It was almost as if a whole bunch of people had read the same couple of books or studies or stats and then just kept regurgitating it over and over and over again. So it became frustrating and felt like a waste of my time and energy to keep reading that same stuff repeatedly. So in my experience, when it comes to CFS recovery, is that to do some research to start, and then once you feel like you've got the gist of everything that's out there, put it down for a while. Every once in a while you can take a peek, see if there's anything new or groundbreaking out there, but if there isn't, then I suggest putting it down and switching your focus to more inspirational and uplifting sources of reading. Now, the second thing to avoid is depressing social media. Now, I am a big supporter of social media as a whole when it's used effectively and appropriately. I think it can have a lot to offer, especially to people who are struggling with chronic illness and cannot get out every day to have those important face-to-face interactions with people. But just as with face-to-face interactions, when it comes to your online interactions, if the people around you are excessively negative, if they're constantly complaining, if they're just bringing you down, then those people need to go. Now, everyone's allowed to have a bad day and vent a little and complain a little bit. That's normal. But if the norm of what they're putting out, if their vibe is continually just depressing and bringing you down, then those people need to go. You need to unfollow them or hide their content or do whatever you need to do to make sure that you keep your space uplifting and positive. You need to be fiercely protective about your online space and make sure the only thing allowed in there are things that are uplifting and positive and motivating and helping you on your healing journey. Now, the third thing to avoid is making illness a part of your identity, because once something becomes a piece of who we think we are, it can be an incredibly difficult thing to get rid of. I'm not saying that you shouldn't talk about your illness, that you shouldn't share your experiences with other people. I think that can be incredibly important. I invite you to think carefully about the nature and the extent to which you are doing that. So if your Instagram handle, for example, is chronically ill and miserable Michelle, you might want to take a minute and think about what psychological impact doing that is having on your recovery process. Now, the fourth thing to avoid is expecting all good days or all better days. And I know this might sound like a bit of a strange one on the surface, because you're probably thinking, I have CFS, I expect all bad days. I wish I could expect all good days. But what I mean by this is that, especially when you are in that recovery phase of CFS, when you're working so hard to get your life back, your health back, sometimes there's a tendency to expect that every day when you wake up should be a little bit better than the day before it, or at the very least the same as the day before that. But the unfortunate reality that I've found with CFS recovery is that it is not a linear process, and that bad days and even bad weeks are going to be a part of that experience. So when I was recovering from CFS, I had to constantly remind myself when those bad days or those bad weeks came, that they were a part of the healing process, that I knew that they were coming, and that they don't mean that I'm failing. They don't mean that I'm not recovering. It's just an unfortunate reality of how this illness goes. And the fifth thing to avoid is treating your good days or your better days as fully recovered days. Because just as it's important to manage your bad days appropriately when you have CFS, it's just as important to manage those good days appropriately as well. There are sometimes these blissful, beautiful days that came along where I almost felt like my old self, the me before I got sick. I felt I had energy and I felt capable of almost of taking on the world. And on those days for a long time, I pretty much always tried. I would run errands and organize my closets and do enough meal prep to last me for a month. I did all those things that I longed to do on my sicker days, but just couldn't. And every single time there was a huge price to pay for that overexertion. It's kind of like spending your entire paycheck on the first day that you get it. For that day, it's going to be super fun, but then for the next 2 weeks or month or however long until you get paid again, it's going to be really rough. So I know it can be a huge ask to ask you to hold back on those days that you're feeling well, but it really is so important to take it easy on those good days so you don't turn that one good day into a world of pain afterwards. Now, the sixth thing to avoid is riding dead horses. Now, let me explain what I mean by this. In those first few months when I was first diagnosed, I went gung-ho trying to recover. I tried everything I could possibly get my hands on. My bank account was draining so rapidly. I was spending a ton of money. I was trying all these different things in this desperate attempt to get well. And if anybody asked me if any of it was working, I always said yes. I would give some response, something like, yeah, little bits, it's slow, but baby steps, I'm getting there. It's, it's looking good. When the reality is that most of what I was doing wasn't helping at all, and I actually wasn't getting any better at all. And it's not that I was lying when I told people that I was getting better, not to them anyways. I was just lying to myself because it was too hard to look at my life, look at my illness, and admit that everything I was doing wasn't working and that I was still just as sick as ever. So it became clear to me fairly early on that one of my mottos needed to be, if you're riding a horse and it dies, you need to get off. Because in those early times with CFS, I would keep riding that dead horse for months before I admitted that what I was doing was not working. My attempts at being an eternal optimist were actually hindering my progress. And I think it's important to be an optimist, and that positive outlook is good, but not blindly optimistic. So eventually I learned that even though I might not like what I saw, I needed to find ways to honestly assess what was going on and adjust my plan accordingly. I needed to learn to fail fast and then tweak my plan and try something new. Which leads right into the seventh thing to avoid, which is judging yourself. So if it was important for me to be able to assess my life honestly, then I need to figure out ways to do that where I didn't get really low as a result of doing it. And I find the best way to do this is to think of yourself as an anthropologist. So you are just a neutral bystander, an objective scientist on a fact-finding mission, looking at this species that is you, just simply with curiosity, as a puzzle to solve. There is no good or bad or right or wrong in what you see, just neutral observations of what's happening. Because too often I've found that if I wasn't behaving in a way that I liked, let's say I'd made a plan for my diet for the week and then I didn't end up following through on it, I would get all harsh on myself and all judgmental, and I would start beating myself up and shaming myself, and I would start to feel really low. And from that place of feeling really low, I wasn't in a place to be motivated and make better choices. From that place of, after having beaten myself up, I felt like sulking. I felt like self-soothing in ways that probably weren't all that healthy. You feel like eating an entire pizza to make yourself feel better, or maybe drinking an entire bottle of wine, or maybe doing both, or maybe buying some things that you can't afford in an attempt to lift your spirits. But the reality is that all of those things that you do actually just make you even worse off than you were before. So it's important to find those ways to assess your life without judgment. So let's say, for example, that you decided that you were going to stop eating foods with added sugar in them. No more sugary foods for you. And then by the end of the week, you found that you actually ate a whole bunch of sugary foods. So instead of beating yourself up, take a step back and just look at it like a puzzle to be solved. Think, what was my plan? Maybe you didn't actually even have a plan. Maybe all you did was say, I'm not going to eat sugary foods, and then unknowingly set yourself up to fail. Perhaps your home was still filled with a bunch of junk food, and of course anyone who has all that stuff around is going to keep eating it. Or maybe you got rid of it, but you didn't replace it with any healthy alternatives. So then in these really hungry states where you were not in a good place to make smart decisions, you went out and bought more junk food. So step back, be a neutral observer, and take what you see and use that to come up with your new plan so that you can be more successful in the future. And the 8th thing to avoid is holding all the bad stuff in. Now, it's important to be positive and have a good outlook, but it's also important to process and acknowledge that bad stuff as well. And in all your efforts to be positive and optimistic, it's likely that you are stuffing some of that bad stuff down along the way that needed to be let out. And I've found one of the easiest, fastest, and most effective ways to get rid of that backlog of negativity that's building up inside you is just to have a good cry. It's amazing how effective and cathartic this can be. Sometimes these tears will come out on their own, and sometimes they need a little coaxing. Just put on your favorite tearjerker. Put on a movie like The Notebook or The Fault in Our Stars, whatever it is that you know is going to get you crying, and just sit back and let all those emotions out. And I find that when I do that, there's usually quite the backlog of tears that were waiting to be let out. Sad seed will come on and tears will start flowing, and 15 minutes later, I'm still doing the ugly cry. And the bad news is that your face is now a hot mess, but the good news is a lot of that backlog of negativity and emotion has been released. So to recap, how to stay mentally strong during CFS recovery, things to avoid. The first is reading too much about chronic fatigue syndrome. The second is exposing yourself to depressing social media. The third is making illness a part of your identity. Fourth is expecting all good days or better days. The fifth is treating your good days as fully recovered days. And the sixth is riding dead horses. Seventh, holding all that negativity in. And eighth, judging yourself. So in my experience, this is the first step to emotional well-being, knowing what to avoid so you can free your mind from negative thoughts. Learn the skills to be the resilient, resourceful, and happy person that we are all striving to be. If you're struggling, reach out for help now. If you're not already seeing a counselor or therapist, start seeing one. And if you need to talk to someone immediately, contact one of the crisis lines in the links I put below this video. All right, that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found at least some of this interesting and informative, and I hope you'll join me next week for part 2 when we talk about the 8 things to start doing to boost our happiness with CFS recovery. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up button below and hit subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this talking about chronic fatigue syndrome recovery. And it would be super helpful if you could throw some comments down below and let me know what topics you'd like to hear more about, because I am working really hard to tailor this information to cover things that are truly useful for people. I put out new videos every Wednesday, so I really hope you'll join me for the next one. That's all for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next week.